This is Jason Herbert, and this is A Reckoning. And my guest today is George Bonanno. He is a professor of clinical psychology and director of Loss, Trauma, and Emotion Lab at Teachers College in Columbia University, and the author of the recently published book, The End of Trauma: How the New Science of Resilience is Changing How We Think About PTSD. George, welcome to Reckoning.
Thanks, Jason. Nice to be here to talk with you.
Yeah, man. Welcome. Welcome to Colorado. You're up in New York, am I right?
I'm in New York City. Yes.
Very good. Well, there's a lot of flights going back and forth between New York and Denver at this time of year as people start zipping their way out to Aspen and Vail and all these other little ski towns that we've got out here. So we get a lot of folks coming back and forth from the Empire State. I'm excited to talk to you, man. I got your book from Basic. I was looking at their catalog. I've got a great relationship with those guys over there, and saw the book and was like, I really want to talk to you about this, because this is something that I'm absolutely fascinated with. I think that there's maybe a lot of misunderstanding about PTSD out there. And as I was reading through the book, one of the things I loved so much about it was how easy you made it to understand these stories that you were talking about, the cases that you were talking about, the different people, and why their cases were relevant, and what the ideas that you're trying to get at here. So, I wanted to talk to you about this. So I guess maybe the first thing to do is let's introduce you and the work that you do, and we'll kind of go from there.
Okay. So I'm a professor of clinical psychology at Columbia. And I've been doing this now, over 30 years. Got into this kind of surreptitiously. I was trained as an experimental psychologist, with a clinical psychologist with a focus on experimental research. And I wanted to change directions a little bit. And at the time, I was offered a postdoctoral position in San Francisco at the university there, UCSF, which is a great medical school, studying bereavement. And I confess, I was not really interested in bereavement. It wasn't even on my radar as a thing to study. And at that time, this is early 1990s, 1991, actually, it was kind of relegated off to the side as a topic of study. So I decided to go out to, I went out to San Francisco. I wanted to go there. I just gotten married. And I looked at the literature on bereavement, and that's when I got interested. The literature seemed to me extremely out of date. It seemed like it was from another era, and it was sort of had not been integrated all the modern research, and had been these assumptions. Everybody is that loses a loved one is in bad shape and needs help, and this completely dominated the way it was conceptualized. So I immediately began to design studies to do things that just hadn't simply been done, and right away we found that people were much more resilient than the literature suggested. And so we just kept doing that. And it took off from there till we broadened to study other kinds of traumatic events. And I've been doing this ever since. And I was not in the plans, but, we've just keep finding this kind of inherent resilience in people over time that was really intriguing.
Yeah, I think that was maybe a thing that I wasn't expecting from the book as I was reading, is that there's almost this uplifting aspect to this idea, is that you can, in fact, overcome a lot of different things that you encounter or go through in your life.
Indeed. Yeah, indeed. It's they're not. These are not fun events. So they're not free of suffering. But the thing is that people suffer for a bit, for a period, and not everybody, of course, but a lot of people, the majority, is what we found, that suffer through it in a sense. In a relatively short time, are able to continue functioning. And the initial suffering is kind of actually part and parcel with resilience, oddly, because it activates the internal mechanisms we have that we all inherit. We all inherit the capacity for these internal mechanisms that allow us to continue living and functioning. So, the initial suffering, in a sense, turns it on. We have a stress response. And the stress response only works when there is stress, right? So there is this initial distress that we experience that then, for most of us, will activate the processes that we have, partly learned, partly inherited, that will drive us towards being able to continue functioning.
Yeah,
living happy lives.
no, it seemed like as I was reading that you're speaking of towards resilience as this sort of like survival mechanism against these forces that, you give these wonderful cases of Jed and the things that he overcomes in the book. And Marin, can I tell you that when I was reading Marin's story, I literally had there was a bit of a fist pump going on for me as I'm reading about her toe and so forth. People will read the book will understand when they get to this aspect. And of course, what goes on with her story. It's absolutely fascinating. I've got a couple questions for you before we jump into the book itself, which is actually more, my doctorate is in Indigenous and environmental history, which is probably fairly far removed from psychology. I don't want to take that for granted. Can you talk to us a little bit about what a professor of clinical psychology actually does up there in Colombia? Are you doing research?
Okay.
Do you work with students?
Yeah.
How does your life operate on a professional basis?
That's a great question. So clinical psychology is essentially the part of psychology that deals with people struggling and often diagnoses and coming apart, et cetera. Clinical psychology was born as a profession after World War II. And the reason was that during World War II, there were lots of psychological challenges. Like, let's put it that way, people struggling and doing well, but struggling with the intensity and the horrors of the things people saw. And anyone who was anywhere related to psychology was called into service kind of as a quasi-therapist. Maybe somebody who studied vision or anything related to that, or animals. And then after the war, it was decided we really need to form a field of psychology, a branch of psychology that deals with this problem in specific, this problem of when people are struggling, when there's mental duress, when people break down. And that's what clinical psychology is. So as an academic, as a researcher, as a professor, I teach courses. I teach a large lecture course on trauma. I teach a course also on emotion and culture and cognition, all intertwined. I teach a course on research. I do a lot of research. That's mostly what I do is research. Bring federal grants and other kinds of funds to do that research. And I think a lot. It's one of my favorite aspects of this profession. And I travel a lot and lecture. But so all of those things together, it's really about really trying to understand these phenomena. And the odd part is, for a clinical psychologist, I study resilience. And that's what I've been doing since the beginning of my career. But the point of that is, and I've argued this many times, if we want to understand dysfunction or psychopathology or PTSD or depression, we won't be able to do that unless we understand the absence of those things. So when people, and in particular, when people go through aversive events that don't develop these disorders, these enduring symptoms, we have to understand who those people are and why. What are they doing? And then what's different in people that do. So that's the focus that I take primarily.
No, I found the stories that you're picking here are really something else. I want to ask you about PTSD itself. I think in current contemporary society, maybe there's a lot of misunderstanding. At least I'm assuming as much. I tend to associate it with soldiers coming back from a war. And you do talk about this in the book, certainly. But can we talk on a basic level, maybe because I want to make sure that our listeners understand. When we talk about PTSD, really, what are we talking about? What's the basic idea of it? What is post-traumatic stress disorder?
Right, it's a great question. You're right. It is wildly misunderstood in the general public. And it's used, I think, quite loosely now and colloquially. And this is something, I think about this from time to time because, we can't control language. Language has a life of its own, particularly American English. American English verbs become nouns and nouns become verbs. We play with it all the time. We invent new words with tremendous rapidity in our culture. Word language aside and semantics aside, a lot of people think of trauma and PTSD as resulting from just bad feelings. So, you get some medical news that you're not happy with, or you fail in something you're trying to do, or your sports team loses, or, you were in a relationship and you find out it's not going too well and maybe it's going to end, or any of those things. Your children are having difficulties or you're having financial problems. All of those things can make us feel really lousy, but they're not they're usually not traumatic in the sense that they don't activate the specific kind of reactions we assume as traumatic reactions and as PTSD. A great example actually was the COVID-19 pandemic, which many people thought of in terms of trauma and PTSD. But it was for the vast majority of people not traumatic in that sense. It was more like a chronic stressor. It was exhausting and stressful, anxiety producing, but it wasn't traumatic. So when we think about trauma and PTSD, when we're confronted with what we think of as a traumatic event, I use the phrase potentially traumatic event, because most events themselves are not traumatic. They're potentially traumatic if they usually think of that as violent and life-threatening. Violent and life-threatening events are the perfect sort of category of things that could be potentially traumatic. When we're exposed to those events, we get really frightened. The alarms go off, and our mind goes into a kind of emergency response that affects our body as well. And we have certain biochemical reactions. So initially, we have what are called a class of neurotransmitters called catecholamines that put us into sort of high gear in our brain. And if we can become overwhelmed, if there's too much of that neurotransmitter, and we might feel kind of in shock or numb. But that happens quickly. Then a little bit later, we get a surge of cortisol in our system. And the cortisol ramps up all of these processes, gets us focused, gets energy, the kind of a almost mythical idea that you have all this energy when you're deeply frightened. But in fact, we do, because the blood and sugar go to our limbs so that we can run and, get away or defend ourselves. We lose the processes that normally that are just not necessary. We often, the classic idea of you wet your pants or soil yourself, and that's because your body's saying it just doesn't matter. Get rid of that right now. This is an emergency situation, and when that happens and it's enduring, we're in the situation for half an hour or something like that. We're having these very intense bodily reactions, and cortisol in particular takes a couple hours to go away. So it gets to our brain and it binds with receptors in our brain. And at that time, it ramps up a lot of the processes, our focus, our memory, our attention. And at the same time, another set of receptors start to shut it down. So it lasts about 2 hours, and it's kind of nicely timed. But for 2 hours, we're in an alternate state of consciousness. I've had experiences since I've been researching this area where I've had the odd experience of paying attention to these processes as they're happening to me. So almost as if I'm watching myself as a professor think, oh my God, look at that. I'm having this reaction. And those reactions are extremely adaptive. They're scary. We're frightened when this is happening, but they're extremely adaptive. And when something like that happens, we remember it. We sometimes have the images or the sequence of events might come back into our mind repeatedly, even when we don't want it to, over the next couple of days or even weeks. We might have a nightmare or two. We might feel on edge because we were just in what we could argue is a life-threatening situation. So all of these initial reactions are highly adaptive and normal. Most people will experience things like this. Even a nightmare or two, intrusive thoughts, these are our minds basically replaying something that was imperative, something really seriously dangerous. And our minds are replaying these things so that we can learn from it. So that we can kind of see, could I have prevented this? Is there something else I could have done? Is this something I just have to understand is in my world and I have to be extra careful for it, whatever the reason. But that gradually goes away from most people. But then for some people, it doesn't. Some people stay in this state of kind of heightened arousal and they keep having intrusive thoughts and keep having memories or nightmares. They begin to gradually feel on edge. They feel on edge and it doesn't seem to go away. And for those people, they also begin to wear out because it's stressful. And that itself causes more problems. And that kind of reaction that doesn't go away after a month or two, we get into the realm of what PTSD is. And PTSD is, by definition, post-traumatic stress disorder. It's essentially an enduring stress reaction that we can't seem to put away, that gets triggered very easily when we're reminded of things. It gets turned on essentially again, or we'll just have something that will remind us and we'll suddenly feel like it's happening. We're in it right at the moment and we're on edge. So that's essentially that course. That's what PTSD is.
So I'm wondering, as a psychologist, are there symptoms that you become as a healthcare provider that you come to recognize when you recognize, hey, this person is definitely suffering from this? Is there a wide variety? In the book, you talk a lot. It's like, wait a second, there are all these different numbers of symptoms that are out there, and things like that. Can people self-diagnose themselves as having PTSD, or does that just kind of come from the fact that we use this term so often? You know,
That's a really great
in the
question. I mean,
world.
we can try to self-diagnose. I think most people shouldn't be doing that. I think a lot of people think they have PTSD when they don't. People that I know in my personal life who even know what I do will ask me, "Do you think I have PTSD?" Because this happened, 2 weeks ago, and I just had a nightmare about it again, right? And I'll usually tell them, they seem to be functioning okay, and I'll say, just give it a little more time. A couple of weeks, you're still in that phase when, in a nightmare or two does not mean you have PTSD. It means you went through something pretty riveting that your mind is sort of trying to look at and understand that you don't want to go through again. At some point, usually when we get into the period of time that's officially inherent in the diagnosis is 1 month. If they're still having a lot of these reactions after 1 month, it's an arbitrary point. It's just kind of used as a heuristic. It's also important to know that the diagnosis of PTSD is never all that accurate. It's a kind of an estimation on the part of the clinician. Many people will tell me in just casual conversations, I was diagnosed with PTSD. And I always have the same reaction. Well, maybe that means you may have PTSD. It doesn't mean you absolutely have PTSD, because whoever gave you that diagnosis is just kind of estimating based on what the diagnosis says. So it's always important to realize that. And it's also not a permanent diagnosis. Diagnosis says in this point in time, if you meet the criteria for that diagnosis, that you are struggling with this post-traumatic disorder, and that, hopefully it'll go away. Hopefully it'll get better. Hopefully you'll get some help. That's the way it works.
I have to ask you a thing that's a bit unrelated, but you just brought it up, and it's something that I wondered. As a psychologist, do you ever get tired of people coming up asking you, friends, family members, neighbors, whomever, to diagnose you on the spot? Because as a historian, no one ever asked me about the 7 Years' War. It never comes up.
Well, I wish I knew that. I have a few questions that I'd like to ask you as a historian. But no, not really. It doesn't happen that often. Also, people that know me know that I don't put a lot of stock in diagnoses. I don't think diagnoses are written in stone. I don't think they don't have a real psychiatric diagnoses don't have a biological basis. They just don't. There isn't one that does. And so, it's a lot of guesswork. And I usually ask people, if people ask me if they have a diagnosis, which they don't that often, if they do, and I know them well, I might ask a few questions like, how are you doing? And I might know from my own experience with them that they're doing okay. And I think, well, these are, either this will go away, or, this is a random thing that happened to you. If somebody really has that diagnosis, it's pretty evident that they usually don't need me to tell them that.
As a scholar, I will tell you that I was not expecting and thoroughly enjoyed the history behind, you're talking about how PTSD and this idea of trauma is relatively new. You talk about the field coming out post World War II. But doesn't it make sense that PTSD would be, isn't a new condition, right? I mean, I would imagine that this would have existed as long as there have been people, or at least as long as there have been mothers-in-law. So, how do we trace trauma historically?
I don't have a great answer to that, because I'm just as it piqued my curiosity as well when I realized this, and I'm definitely not the first person to point this out. Other people have noted, scholars have noted, that you don't read about PTSD in the historical record until, and it's really not anywhere remote until much, much more recently. And that's curious, because grief, which is related, it's a different phenomenon, it's a different set of mechanisms, but it's related. You do find lots of evidence of grief in the Iliad, for example, which is, I don't know how old the Iliad is, wherever we date it, 3,000 years, something like that. Maybe not quite that old, but you do find references to grieving, but we don't find references in the great works that we have at our disposal of this kind of nightmares and flashbacks and being unable to get over violent events the way we now associate with PTSD. We don't see it in accounts of soldiers. And why that is raises all kinds of curious questions. Does it mean we invented it recently? No, I don't think so. And I think the way I kind of think of it from a historical perspective, and I mentioned this in the book, are the diaries of Samuel Pepys. And because Samuel Pepys, for those of you who don't know Samuel Pepys, there are people out there, Pepysophiles, just, who pore over his diaries. For 10 years, he kept a diary where he wrote down pretty much everything, his innermost thoughts, and he didn't intend those to be read, at least in his lifetime, so he was very candid. And he had firsthand experiences with the London fire of 1666. So we were talking 17th century, Isaac Newton, what was the king at the time? I don't remember. And he was a confidant of the king. The king asked him to, assay the damage in London. So he went around and he experienced the heat of the fire. He experienced all the ghastly images, and he couldn't prevent himself, at least 6 months later, from still having frightening thoughts about it in bed and having nightmares. And he, in his diary, which is really interesting, he's very confused by this. He's asking himself, why am I having these? I'm paraphrasing, but why am I having these thoughts? He didn't understand it. And that to me says a lot. It says that these things do happen to people and they just couldn't make sense of it. So that it wasn't the kind of thing you would openly talk about. So I think that's a hint that, people were having PTSD symptoms even when they weren't being recorded, in documents. Why that is, I don't know. Maybe it was stigmatized. Maybe it was just too strange and mysterious. Maybe it wasn't nearly as prevalent as it is now. It's hard to know, but it's a curious phenomenon.
Yeah, and I wonder, you actually speak towards the stigmatization of that. I'm obviously thinking about shell shock and the idea that initially, cowardice. I'm thinking about Patton, specifically the instance where he got himself in trouble for slapping around the soldier. I think now, correct me if I'm wrong, when I see or hear about PTSD, reckoned in a way that is sympathetic in our current society, but has that always been the case?
That I didn't hear everything you said. You cut out for a second. So.
I was saying that in our current society, people with PTSD now seem to be treated sympathetically. If we see someone who is suffering or hear of someone who is suffering, maybe soldiers come back or a 9/11 survivor, perhaps. But I wonder if that was always the case. Like we said, initially there were different terms for what's going on here. So was PTSD always viewed sympathetically, or has that been a thing where people have kind of come around on this?
No, I don't think it was viewed sympathetically at all until only recently, actually. I would say even just the last decade, maybe even sooner than that. It wasn't ever formalized as a diagnosis until 1980. But, you brought up World War I, and I think a lot of it was driven by war, because wars have been ubiquitous, and wars are wholesale exposure to horrific things. And in World War I, there was the phrase "shot at dawn," right? So soldiers were shot at dawn for cowardice if they, often on the battlefield, if they said, I can't do that, I can't bear it anymore, and they were considered cowards, despite the fact that there was a basic top-down command, that shell shock is real, but in the heat of the battlefield, it was often not taken seriously. People came home from wars disturbed, and it was as if, I think, perhaps because, grief is something that we all experience. It's unavoidable. And the longer we live, the more grief we experience. And we recognize it in ourselves and in other people. Trauma, on the other hand, is kind of in the eye of the beholder. When somebody goes through something horrific, we can only kind of guess what they went through. And when people go off to war and they come back, the people they come back to really don't know what they went through, but they just know they're acting kind of funny, or they're never quite been the same. And you hear lots of references to that in the literature of the last couple centuries, that they never quite got over it, but we don't know what they didn't get over. We don't know what they were actually experiencing, and that may be because it was really hard for people to wrap their minds around. but it was always viewed a little askance, as if even not that sympathetically, oh my gosh, you went to war, let me take care of you. It was more like, I don't know what's going on with that guy. It was a little bit seen. It was seen as a kind of a stain, I'd say.
Yeah, I'm thinking, specifically, there's tremendous film, First Blood, which obviously very in our own culture. The very first Rambo film is dealing specifically this soldier is coming back, and
this is a Rambo film. Okay, it was one.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. The very first film that I deal so much with pop culture and how we understand the world around us. And this film comes out in I think 81. I think the book is first written in I think 71, 72, 73, somewhere in this range. Clearly suffering from PTSD, or at least I think so. But also seen by outsiders as a vagrant, vagabond, a guy who can't get his stuff together. You know?
And there was still a lot of hiding out for people if they had those symptoms. And I think really this sort of straw that broke the camel's back really was in the U.S., the Vietnam War, the U.S. involvement in the war in Vietnam, because many, many soldiers came back seriously psychologically harmed, and the war was enormously unpopular. And I think the fact that there were so many soldiers who were struggling, and it was so widely acknowledged, and really the mental health world actually began to lobby them. We need we need a diagnosis. We need some way to help these people, because there was without a diagnosis. Diagnoses, I often tell my students, diagnoses are societal concepts masquerading as scientific concepts. They're not really scientific, but we use them in our society. We use them to say, okay, you meet the criterion that we can help you. You meet the criterion that we can pay for this with insurance or whatever other mechanism we have. And the mental health world was saying we need a diagnosis for PTSD to take care of these soldiers who are coming home. And it wasn't until 1980, a full decade or so after that war really wound down. And many of the soldiers, when I first did my first clinical work, it was with Vietnam veterans. And many of them had been self-medicating already for, 15, 20 years at that point, in drinking, drugs, violent behavior, and it was very hard to get at, to help somebody that far along. But it was then that we finally began, that's when the sympathetic attitude began to develop, I think really for the first time in human culture around trauma.
Well, can I ask you a little bit about the caregiver experience here, about other clinicians? Because I wonder, you obviously have this network of colleagues and students and mentors in your own career path who have worked with people with PTSD. Is there an effect that rubs off on clinicians where you're like, I am working with people who are going through some really tough times? Does that ever come back on the caregiver as well? It's like, wow, this is very difficult for me to try to walk another person through or to help them out.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard people talk about that.
Mm-hmm.
I can't answer that personally because I haven't been a full-time therapist since I did this for 1 year in my training, and I haven't been a full-time therapist since then. I've always been around PTSD and around grief reactions in my research and in clinical work. But I think that if you're always around people that are going through the worst things possible, there's a certain kind of an understanding that one develops, where it's a sense of, these things happen and these people experience these kind of things. I don't think it's dangerous for the clinicians. I don't think it's that necessarily harmful for the clinicians. One thing it does do, though, which is kind of surprising, is it distorts clinicians' view of the world sometimes to us. And this is where I think we get the idea, a lot of the ideas that trauma is ubiquitous and PTSD is prevalent everywhere comes from people who good, well-meaning people trying to help other people. But if you're around trauma all the time, you begin to think that that's the norm. You see a person who's been exposed to something horrific, they have PTSD. You see another person who's exposed to something horrific, they have PTSD. And I contrasted my own experience, both working in a clinical context and then now doing my research for 30-some years, where I get people who've been exposed to really difficult things, subversive things, horrific things, but we get the broad population of people and we see that most people are resilient. And then that's extremely uplifting for me personally, right? When I began to see we are resilient people. And, as a race, the human race, we are resilient. And that's inspiring in many ways.
Well, that's the perfect segue to really what I want to get into here with the book here is this idea of the science of resilience. You're talking about a new response to PTSD through resilience. You introduced a concept here that I wanted maybe to flesh out here, this idea of essentialism. And I'm kind of wondering how essentialism relates to how we've traditionally conceptualized PTSD and then like how we move forward from there as far as we conceptualize moving forward.
Yeah. So essentialism is assuming that something has an essence, it's in nature, right? So that the idea that PTSD is in nature. And we make this mistake all the time as human beings. It's because we're imperfect. We're all just trying to make sense of the world. But we can essentialize something, and there are things that are very much essentialist, that are, I could say we run safe ground to say they're real. Like a cat is not a bird, or a cat's not a dog even, as dog and cat owners know very well. Cats and dogs are very different creatures. I remember if you see videos of dogs being pulled out of water in a flood and they're just licking people and they're all happy. And then you see videos of a cat being pulled out of the water in the flood and they just walk away, So there's something essential to those characters. A fish is different than an alligator or something like that. But the idea, we also then essentialize something like PTSD where we assume this is in nature. And I think that's a very dangerous way to go. And you see this in the animal literature where people are trying to decide if animals have PTSD. And I don't think animals do have PTSD. I think they learn danger and they learn what's dangerous, and they might be frightened of what's dangerous, which is very healthy and very normative. But they probably don't develop PTSD, I'm guessing. It's hard to know. It's really hard to know. So, I think we have to always keep in mind when we say something exists, is it the way we defined it? And PTSD is, of course, something we are defining as existing in a certain way. And so, that's a dangerous assumption to make, that it's there and we discovered it. You can make that assumption about lots of things, but not. I think psychiatric disorders are pretty fragile in that sense, in terms of them existing in nature.
Can we talk about the flexibility mindset?
Yes, of course.
What this is, and how do we achieve that?
Well, the flexibility mindset. So flexibility came about in my work. Partly, I was studying flexibility in general, and then I began to realize its relationship to resilience. And it's really the idea that no behavior, no way of dealing with the world is perfect or all bad. We tend to think of, like some things like social support or talking with other people, expressing our emotions as just sort of golden behaviors. These are really good things to do, but suppressing your emotions or distracting yourself or, going off and not talking about something, these are avoidant and they're suppressive, and we shouldn't be doing these things. But in fact, the empirical reality, the research shows us that the good things that we think are all good are sometimes not very effective, and sometimes they're actually the wrong thing to be doing. They make the matters worse. They make a situation worse. And sometimes those things that we think are not very healthy are actually just what we need to be doing. Suppression, and I first got interested in this through suppression. So emotional suppression, not showing the emotions you feel, is actually extremely adaptive in some situations. A great example, silly examples, I'm part Sicilian, and I talk with my hands, and I have a very volatile kind of emotional experience. I might get angry really quickly, or I might get extremely excited and loud, and you really have to one has to learn to regulate that, to dampen that down, and not do that sometimes. But also, there are great clinical examples. For example, after 9/11, many of the parents that we interviewed a lot of people after 9/11 who were in the towers or ran from the towers or, got away, with their lives, but thought they were going to die. And a number of the parents told us that they really had to not show their distress, not show how upset they were in the presence of their children. So they didn't want to frighten their children. And this is a natural, instinctive thing that parents do. So it gradually led to this idea that flexibility is actually how we regulate ourselves, how we deal with the world. And as I began to do the research on it, became clear that this is really how our minds work. We are actually a very flexible brains, us human beings, and we adapt. And adapting is about finding the right, sort of the most effective approach to every situation we deal with. So, and we're constantly doing this. Our brains are capable of this, but we constantly are doing this. And it's something that hasn't been studied a whole lot. So I got into this and studied this for a while and began to see its relationship. I'm now in the process of trying to understand it further.
Can we talk a little bit about resilience and like the resilience paradox?
Yeah.
As well, and like
sure,
what this means? Yeah.
So this is actually, the resilience paradox is really what led me to flexibility. So when we try to study, we first began to identify people that were resilient by simply just following people over time, right? And we were able to identify, gosh, the majority of people that we were following here are not showing a lot of symptoms. They're functioning well. They're not happy about what they went through, but they got through it, and they might still have some lingering, memories of it, disturbing thoughts, but they got through it okay. As we studied those people, we began to try to understand, okay, so who are those people? The majority of people show this resilient pattern. Who are they? And who are the people that don't show this pattern? And we began to identify various factors that correlated with resilience. And this was a low-hanging fruit initially, obvious things like positive emotion, problem-solving skills, emotional expression, support from other people, resources, and those things all made sense. And at that time, there was a very common assumption you could see everywhere. Basically, you see articles all the time touting the 3 or the 5 or the 7 magic, the key traits of resilient people, right? And I think that's an assumption that there are resilient people and non-resilient people, and the resilient people have these few really important traits. But as we kept doing research, we kept finding more and more factors, traits, behaviors, characteristics that correlated with resilience until we're really up to 50 or 60, different things at this point. And it keeps growing. The more we look at, the more we find. We found genetics, we found personality variables, we found different demographic variables, all kinds of other things. Are people finding meaning or not? Are they ruminating? Are they talking to other people? Are they keeping silent? All these things were correlating with resilience. At one point, we said, well, how do we make sense of this? And I thought about this for years. How do I make sense of all of these factors? And then as I began to look at this even more closely and in earnest try to solve this, I realized that these factors are all what we call small effects. They have a very small effect size. That's a statistical term. But what it means is basically if we measure one of these things, let's just say expressing emotion or optimism or social support, and we try to predict who will be resilient based on the data we have, we don't do a very good job with those 3 things. They have very small, they move the needle only just a little bit. They only explain a little bit of who will be resilient and who not. And so that's a puzzle itself. That became the puzzle. We know all these factors, but we don't still know how to predict who will be resilient based on these factors because they don't do very much. And they, above all, don't tell us how it works. We just measure a bunch of things. They all correlate with resilience. That doesn't illuminate how it works. And we've tried machine learning. We've tried all kinds of approaches, computational approaches, where we can measure a whole bunch of things. And we do a little bit of a better job, but still not as good as we thought we would. And we still are stuck with all these different factors. So you got 20 or 30, sometimes in studies we've had 60, 70 factors to look at, and they're all related to resilience in some way. You have to ask yourself, well, so what is a resilient person doing? If all of this stuff going on, how are they making sense of it? And that's the paradox. And that's where that led me to realize that flexibility seemed to be the key, because flexibility is about figuring out what's happening and what do I need to do right now in this situation? What's going to get me through this situation that maybe wouldn't have got me through the situation the other day, or maybe tomorrow I have to find something to get me through the same situation, but tomorrow, because it changes a little bit. And it's really just a matter of adapting on the fly, basically. And it is what we do. And the more I looked at this is what we do as human beings. We're constantly adapting because we can't just do the same thing every time. It won't get us. And, many people are unhappy with the election. I don't want to get into that at all. But many people are very unhappy with the election. And those people are confronted with, how do I deal with this now? right? Many people are, say, unhappy with, I don't know, whatever else is happening. I have very good friends in the Republic of Georgia. They're struggling right now with what's going on with their government. How do they deal with that? You name it, whatever else is happening, a mass shooting somewhere or a natural disaster. We just had massive flooding and, hurricane damage in the U.S., in the mountains, and what was it, South Carolina? That's
North
not
Carolina,
supposed to happen.
yeah.
North Carolina, not supposed to happen. So all those people devastating that region, all those people are struggling at how they have to deal with that. And they can't simply say, okay, well, I'll express emotion and I'll be good, or I'll meditate. They have to find whatever's going to work or whatever combination of factors is going to work to get them through that psychologically each day at a time. And it almost sounds like a cliche, but it is really how our minds function. We just have to keep adapting as we go along. And that's what flexibility is. So in my work, we've tried now to, tease it apart, identify the different pieces of it. And that's, I won't go into a lot of that because it gets awfully complicated, but that's really where we're at right now. And that is what people seem to do.
Yeah, it felt, as I'm reading through the book, almost like a real-time pragmatism or something along those lines, where it's like, look, the traditional frameworks for how I understand my life, right, are not functioning in this particular situation. And I've got to adapt and think outside of maybe these particular lines, And again, I also don't want to spend a whole lot of time on the election, but, after the election, I see people all over Blue Sky, I have friends and things like that. There are lots of people expressing lots of different opinions.
Yeah.
And I'm like, okay, I have to get up and go to work tomorrow. I've got 2 kids.
Yes.
I've got a life I've got 2 kids and an 80-pound puppy. I almost in this way have to set aside my feelings about this thing because they frankly got in the way of my ability to provide for myself and the things that matter to me.
Yeah.
We have Christmas coming up though, and I'm wondering this idea about spirituality. I'm not a religious person at all. I left that in Kentucky years and years ago. But I'm wondering, how does spirituality play into this idea of resilience, of recovery, the belief in a higher power or a purpose?
Well, my answer to that may strike some people as a little odd, and might strike you as a little odd. I don't know, is that spirituality or religious feelings or spiritual feelings or sense of a higher power? It's just like everything else, really. It works sometimes and sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it really lets us down. And there are great stories, anecdotally, great anecdotes of people who are extremely focused on religion, who are then something happens and they're devastated because it didn't work. God didn't answer your prayers or whatever, something like that. We're doing research in Israel right now, and since the Hamas attacks of October 7th. So I'm collaborating with some colleagues there who had data beginning October 10th going forward. And we found the pattern of people. We found that most Israelis were resilient, but the number one predictor one of the best predictors of being in that group was Orthodox religion. And the people who, and also supportive of the government, the people who were less supportive of the government, critical of the government, and were secular, and a lot of secular people in Israel, were the people struggling more in that particular context. In another context, it's going to be the opposite, because then people who are, more secular are going to people who are thinking a bit differently. So we see this across all these different kinds of events, that sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. I have a cartoon that I sometimes show. It's a little ridiculous, but it's a picture of cartoon of a woman being burned at a stake, obviously not now, in the past. And another woman is in medieval garb is saying to her, "Have you tried yoga?" Which is, yoga is great stuff, but it's not going to solve every problem, And again, it gets back to our capacity, our brain's capacity to adapt. I like to tell people, many people know this, but it takes about 25 years for our brains to kind of be fully developed. It depends on the part of the region of the brain. The brain develops, different regions develop at different rates, but it takes about 25 years for us kind of more or less to be ready to go, which automobile insurance companies have known this forever, because rates go down at 25, when people are less impulsive and more mature. But that time, it's not an accident that it takes us so long to develop. We have more cortical neurons than really any other creatures on Earth relative to our brain size. And that's because our brains are constantly developing that in a way that allows us to learn. And many creatures are born almost ready to go. And our humans there's a different evolutionary strategy. We're born, we develop over time, which gives us enormous capacity to learn. And so that we can learn to adapt to whatever we're confronted with. And this is really inherent in humans. And it's a capacity we have. We don't always use it, but it's a capacity that we definitely have.
Wondering, when we talk about this flexibility mindset, and it really kind of seems like comes down to these ideas, and not to give away the work here, but this idea, this really positive mindset that, look, there is a solution to be found here. There's a way to handle whatever it is that we're confronting, whether we're the loss of a loved one or a limb or a job or whatever it is that I feel like in a lot of ways, this goes beyond PTSD, just confronting life itself, right?
Yeah.
The thing that I found so much, really, because as I read the book, and you start talking about this positivity, boy, the pages just, I got to tell you, I just started churning through pages because I was really eating this up. This idea that, there's the simple belief here that you can do something, right?
Yeah.
And then there's like this call to action. I'm wondering, though, George, how do we train ourselves for this? How do we prepare ourselves to be in the position to where when the worst happens, we're ready to respond to it in a way that is flexible?
Question. That's a great question. And we can't, and I know that you may have some listeners who are thinking, I can't do that. And I think there's a part of it's an education, and part of it's just going out and living life. The educational part, it's important to know that this is part of human nature. One of the things I like, and I won't get into the details, but we've broken flexibility down into its component parts. Like a good scientist, that's what we do. Right. One of the parts we call feedback, where we try something based on our best guess, and then we pay attention to whether or not it worked, and we correct it and try something else if it didn't work. And this is something I think a lot of people don't know. And it's an empirical reality that all animals learn by trial and error. And so we also deal with the world by trial and error. Even the healthiest people, people who are showing the most resilience the most often, are still coping by trial and error. They don't just say, oh yeah, this is situation X and I'm going to do this and I'm good, I'm golden. That doesn't really happen. Everybody tries something to see if it works. So we can make good guesses, we can make very good guesses, but we still have to readjust. And then that's how we learn. And so there's this idea that, this sense that we're adapting this way, and that's how we do it. And that's the sort of educational part, is to learn to know this. The other part is that through experience, we learn we can do things. I did a podcast and an interview with Joe Sena, who has a podcast called Spartan Up, and it's about he does a fairly extensive obstacle course kind of race where you have to drag yourself up a muddy hill and dive in ice cold water and climb up a rope ladder and slip back down. And it's, 6 miles long and things like that. And he basically told me after I described flexibility, and this is what people learn when they do this obstacle course. Even though, they get through it, most people get through it despite their thoughts. And they have this sense of, I can do things. And I had this own experience myself. I don't know how many people are going to be willing to do this. Probably not many, but I do what's called cold exposure exercise. So I run outside. I don't do water because I live in Manhattan and there aren't a whole lot of bodies of water I can jump into. But I go outside in just shorts and shoes, and I run all winter long on the steps near my building. I live near a park. And I just run up and down the steps. And I've been out when the temperature reached 0 Fahrenheit. And I do about a half hour, and then I'm tired from running up and down the steps. I've had people, there was a road crew once, and they called out to me, asked if I needed a coat. And I realized they thought I was some homeless guy, because what kind of nut would be out there in bare skin. But when I started doing that, I had this exhilarating realization that I could do this. Who thought that my mind could tell me it was okay to run outside in zero temperature with all this skin showing, and I would be fine. I would feel okay. Right. So it tells you when you try things in life, you learn, oh yeah, I can do this. I can get through this. This isn't what I thought it was. But, and we do that our entire lives to more or less degree. But, a lot of people might hear this and think, well, good for you, buddy. You can go out and run. I'm not going to do that. And they may not want to, or they may not want to, to do anything that pushes their limits. But psychologically, physically, whatever way we do it, we do this to some extent anyway. We try things and we learn how to do things. Anyone that's learned a language, anyone that's learned how to cook, anyone that's learned a new job, anyone that's learned how to fix something, anyone that's learned how to find their way in a trail, anyone that's learned how to use a smartphone, all of these things, we learn how to do it. And it shows us that we can learn how to do these things. And coping with adversity is just another instance of that same thing. We just learn how to do it. We learn how to deal with it. And I think that's a real important thing to understand for people.
Yeah, I have to tell you, I found this work just so incredibly uplifting, because I think you're absolutely right. And I'm thinking as you're talking about the only things I've been through, I always like to say the two most difficult things I ever went through were my divorce and graduate school. And I got to go through at the same time, but you come through those things. You're like, wait, I handled this, and I sure as hell did not want to. Right.
Yeah.
And and as I read through the examples, Frida Kahlo, Jed, Marin, these folks are, going through these different things and coming through. Not all at the same pace, and certainly not all with the same results here, right? But you see this flexibility.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
There's a relevant bit from a psychologist named Dan Gilbert, who's also a friend of mine, who wrote a popular book a while back. But he has this concept called affective forecasting. And what that is when we have emotional reactions, we're very bad at predicting how long they will last, because their emotions seem to evolve because they're so intense, and they do things to us. Like when we're angry, it draws all our attention to the fact that something's causing us to be angry. When we're frightened, it draws all of our attention to the fact that there is something really dangerous here. At least I'm thinking it's dangerous, and I need to deal with it. When we feel sad, it's because we know we've lost something, and our mind needs to kind of reconcile that. We have to realize it's gone, whatever we lost, a person or a thing we care about. So when we have those emotional reactions, it feels to us like they will last forever. And emotions are by definition short term. They last a couple hours at most. And even if we might feel sad for weeks, we're not sad all the time. It comes and goes. So Dan Gilbert's research, he, for example, looked at people who were facing some outcome that they really dreaded. And he asked them before it happened, how would you feel if this happened? A great example was professors who didn't get tenure. If you didn't get tenure, how would you feel? Dreadful. It would be the worst thing. My life would be over. If you lost this job, how would you feel? If these investments you made failed, if this house that you had burned down, how would you feel? Any of these things, we say, this would be the worst thing ever. I'll feel terrible. After these things happen, in a very short time later, people are like, oh yeah, I'm okay. I'm doing something else now, or, I didn't want that to happen. And I have sometimes it's harder than others, but, it's a short-lived thing. But we're driven by the idea that this is just going to be so terrible, and keeps us from digging into it.
Yeah, there's like this fixation on the worst. And, there seems to be, and I was just talking to a friend of mine who is a scholar of Roman history about her hatred of what she calls broicism, all the stuff we see, the stoicism stuff that we see on social media.
Yeah.
Misinterpreting or using it for their own ends and things like that. But there does seem to be, at least in my own mind, this idea that when we talk about this flexibility, is there's almost a stoic nature to this aspect. Am I wrong? And this idea is like, I cannot control what has happened here, but I can control my response to it. Am I right?
It very absolutely, and I think I quoted Seneca, who was one of the Stoics in the book. Yeah, absolutely. There's wisdom in that, and it does take us, and it does. I mean, the concept of the flexibility mindset is actually different than the mechanism, but the flexibility mindset is the idea that where we tell ourselves, "I will get through this somehow. I know it's going to be okay in the future, and I'll get through it somehow. So let me just get down to it." And there are a bunch of different bits of psychology that come into play here. One is optimism. It'll be okay eventually. The sun will shine again. Another is this thing we call challenge orientation or challenge appraisal. And that's when we say, okay, this thing happened. Initially when something bad happens, we feel really threatened. We focus on how bad it is. And that's necessary. We have to focus on how bad it is in order to get a kind of sense of what we're dealing with. But after that point, then many people will shift to the challenge. Okay, I didn't want this to happen, but it did. What do I need to do to get past this? And that's when we kind of dig in and say, okay, there is something I can do. Let's do it. And that focus, it narrows the focus to right now, not the future. It's right now. This is what I'm struggling with, and I need to get past that. And so we take one step and we get past it. And there may be something else to get past, but that's really how we do it, basically. And it requires us to kind of focus in a little bit. And it's a little bit of work. It's unpleasant, but it's what we need to do.
No, I tell you, I absolutely love this. I'm thinking about this now because I know I'm heading to the gym later. You do your running. I have to go like hoist 350 pounds over my head and hope that I'm not going to drop it on my neck.
Good for you.
Well, it's challenging the joints at this point in time. The hard part I'm finding is reckoning with my own age and realizing I can't lift like I once did. The ego lifting is a thing of the past, right? We've got the holidays coming up, George. You've got this book out now. What's next for you?
Well, I'm there. It's a very busy time for me academically because we're coming to the end of the semester. I've started working on another book. I don't know when I'm going to have time to do it, but I'm working on it now. And it's really about flexibility, and it's a little bit about what I've talked about, that we are basically flexible beings. It's above all just even what we try to do. We have the tools already, in a sense. And I want to write that book. I do a lot of research, and I need to slow down on the research. As I get older, I keep thinking I really have to slow down so I'm not so busy. But I find it impossible not to. And my colleagues and I just put in a grant to do research in Ukraine. Not research, but to test digital health interventions in Ukraine and in Georgia with refugees in Georgia and the soldiers in Ukraine. I met some soldiers in Ukraine recently at a NATO meeting, and I was really taken by what they're struggling with. Those are problems that need solving. They're also things that are interesting to me as a researcher. And so we just put in that's something I may be doing in the near future. We're also developing a training for flexibility. And we'll test it first to make sure it does what we think it does. And that would be some way also to give people some tools to work with. And, it just keeps going from there.
And I'm excited. I'm going to this has been, for me to be able to read the book and then to have this conversation with you, George, has just been enlightening. It's been uplifting, and it's been a real joy for me to have you on the pod and talk to you. So thank you. I can't thank you enough for taking the time to talk to you today, all the way from New York. We'll have to get you out here on the mountain at some point in time.
That sounds fun. That sounds really fun. Jason, thank you, though.
Thank you so much for being here.
You're very generous in your comments, and I really enjoyed talking with you.
Awesome. All right, everybody. Hey, thank you so much to our guest, Dr. George Bonanno. You can find his book. We'll post links to this online. The End of Trauma, How the New Science of Resilience is Changing How We Think About PTSD, right here. This has been awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jason.